Have you ever heard of Job? A man whose story has crossed millennia, challenging our understanding of suffering, faith, and purpose. But what if I told you this story begins with a bet in heaven?
Wait, what do you mean a bet in heaven? Are you serious? Like God and Satan rolling dice?
No, no dice involved. But yes, this story starts with a conversation between God and Satan. And what was said there changed everything for Job. But before we go on, hit that like button, leave a comment about what you know regarding Job, and share this with anyone who loves a good story. Shall we dive deeper into this narrative? It all begins in a moment that seems to transcend time. We're in heaven before the throne of God. Angelic beings gather in reverence until a dark presence enters. It's Satan, the accuser.
Wait, but why is he there? Wasn't he kicked out of heaven? How does he show up for this meeting?
Great question. In this context, Satan is seen as the one roaming the earth, observing and bringing accusations. He still had permission to appear before God because his role was to question the integrity of humankind.
Oh, I see. Like a prosecutor, someone who's always accusing us.
Exactly. And on this particular day, he makes a bold accusation. He tells God that Job's loyalty is bought, that Job is only good and righteous because he has everything: wealth, health, family.
Wow. And what does God say to that?
God defends Job. He trusts in his servant's faith, but Satan taunts, "Take everything away from him, and you'll see how he curses you to your face." And so, the test begins. Now, before we go on, let's set the scene of who Job was. He lived in the land of Uz, which historians believe was somewhere in what we know today as the Middle East, possibly between Arabia and Edom.
Uz. Does that place really exist, or is it just symbolic?
It really existed, at least in tradition. Uz was known for its wealth and stability. Job was a prosperous man, with vast herds, many servants, and a large family. But most importantly, he was known as a man of integrity who feared God.
So basically, Job was the guy everyone wanted to be, rich, just, and happy.
Exactly. But here's the crucial point. This story isn't about wealth or status, it's about character, faith, and what happens when everything you have disappears. God allows Satan to test Job, but with one condition: don't take his life. And so, it all begins. In a single day, Job receives devastating news.
Bad news, like what?
First, his servants are killed. Then his herds are stolen by invaders. And as if that weren't enough, a wind destroys the house where his children are gathered. No one survives. Job loses everything.
I can't even imagine losing your family like that all of a sudden. How did he react?
He tore his clothes and fell to the ground in mourning. But then he did something surprising. He worshipped God. He said, "Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I will return. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord."
He still praised God after all that?
Yes, and that reaction is just the beginning. Job passes the first test, but Satan doesn't give up. He believes that if Job loses his health, he will finally curse God, and God once again allows it. Now, Job himself will be struck.
Wait, there's more? Wasn't all that happened to him enough?
No. Job's story is an intense journey filled with questions, but it's also one of the greatest lessons on faith and humanity ever told. And that's what we're going to explore. Stay tuned, because what happens next is as deep as it is surprising. When we think Job has already suffered everything he possibly could, the challenge intensifies. Satan is granted permission to strike Job, but without taking his life. And what follows is even more agonizing.
What do you mean by strike? What does he do to Job?
Job is afflicted with terrible sores, from the soles of his feet to the top of his head. We're talking ulcers, open wounds, and unbearable pain. He takes a piece of pottery to scrape his sores as he sits among the ashes. In that culture, ashes were a symbol of mourning and humiliation.
And these sores, were they literal, or did they have some symbolic meaning?
Good question. The accounts indicate they were literal, but they also carry a symbolic weight: the destruction of human dignity. Job, who was once respected and admired, is now reduced to a state of complete physical and emotional suffering.
How does he react? Does he remain steadfast as before? Or does he start to question things?
He remains silent, at least for the moment, But this is where his friends begin to arrive and things start to change. In the midst of his suffering, Job receives a visit from 3 friends, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar. They come from afar with the intention of comforting him. In that culture, visiting a friend in mourning was a gesture of solidarity.
Right, so they're there to support Job, but if I recall correctly, these friends end up causing more trouble than comfort, don't they?
Exactly. But in the beginning, they follow an important custom. They spend 7 days and 7 nights in silence, simply sitting beside Job. They respect his pain without saying a word. It's a powerful gesture.
7 days in silence. That's rare nowadays. We're so used to trying to fix the problem of someone who's suffering that we forget sometimes just being present is enough.
That's true, but once they begin to speak, everything changes. After 7 days of silence, Job finally speaks, and what he says is deeply moving.
What does he say?
He curses the day of his birth. He says he wishes he had never been born, such is his pain. In short, he doesn't curse God, but he starts to question the reason for such suffering.
That makes sense. After all he's been through, who wouldn't question? But isn't that dangerous to question like that?
In those days, it was considered very bold to question God. But what we see here is Job's humanity. He isn't perfect. He feels pain, doubts, and even despair. And that's exactly what makes his story so real.
I see. He's not rejecting God. He's trying to understand why all this is happening.
Exactly. And this is where his friends start to respond, but not always in the best way. Eliphaz is the first to speak. He begins gently, but soon introduces the main idea of the friends' arguments, that Job is suffering because in some way he has sinned.
Sinned? But Job was considered the most righteous man on earth.
Yes, but in their view, suffering was always the result of sin. It was a common belief at the time. Eliphaz says something like, "Think carefully, Job. Has an innocent person ever perished?"
So instead of consoling him, they basically start accusing Job. What kind of friends are these?
Friends who, although well-intentioned, had a limited perspective. They thought they were helping, but they only made things worse. Bildad and Zophar follow the same line, being even harsher with their words.
And Job, does he respond?
Yes, Job defends his integrity. He argues there is no sin in his life that could justify such suffering. More importantly, he begins to express a deep desire to understand why God allowed this. The exchange of dialogues between Job and his friends raises questions that transcend the centuries. Why do bad things happen to good people? Is there a divine explanation for human suffering?
These questions are just as relevant today as they were back then. And from a historical standpoint, this reflects a lot of that society's beliefs, right?
Exactly. The idea that suffering was always the result of sin was central in many ancient cultures. But the story of Job goes beyond that. It starts to challenge this simplistic view.
Interesting. It's almost as if Job represents a new way of thinking, questioning the conventions of his time.
Yes, and that's what makes the book so fascinating. It's not just a story about a righteous man who suffers. It's a profound debate about justice, faith, and the character of God.
And there's another detail I find important. Even when Job questions, he never abandons his faith. Many scholars point that out.
True. And that balance between questioning and trusting is one of the greatest lessons of this story. Job is cornered. He has lost everything, suffers from unbearable physical pain, and to make matters worse, his friends, who came to console him, are now indirectly accusing him. But even in his pain, Job finds the strength to respond.
I keep wondering how he does it. I mean, he's literally devastated, and he still has to argue against his own friends.
It's impressive, isn't it? But this is where Job's strength of character shines. He doesn't accept the accusations of sin. Instead, he challenges his friend's logic. He says something like, "You talk about justice, but look around us. How many wicked people prosper while the righteous suffer?" With that response, Job not only defends his innocence, but also raises a question that still resonates today: the apparent injustice in the world.
That's something everyone has wondered at some point, right? Why do so many bad people seem to do well while good people suffer so much?
Exactly. And Job doesn't just ask this question, he puts it at the very heart of his defense. He begins to question God directly, asking for answers. He wants to understand why, despite being faithful, he's experiencing such disproportionate suffering. But Job's friends don't give up. Bildad, the second to speak, answers with even more conviction. He claims that God is just and does not tolerate sin. According to him, if Job is suffering this much, it must be because he deserves it.
What do you mean, deserves it? Bildad is basically saying Job is guilty without any proof. That's so unfair.
It really is. But Bildad's argument reflects a very common belief of that time, the so-called divine retribution. The idea was simple and dangerous. Those who obey God are blessed. Those who disobey suffer. Only Bildad overlooks something crucial. Suffering isn't always punishment.
And that view wasn't just cultural, right? Even today, some people think that way. Like if something bad happens, then the person must have done something wrong.
Absolutely, that mentality persists. But Job, even in his pain, pushes back. He acknowledges that God is just, yet he says, "How can I prove my innocence before God? If I went to court, who could argue against him?" It's a statement filled with anguish, but also with reverence. Job doesn't doubt God's greatness, he only wants to understand. As the debates between Job and his friends continue, something remarkable happens. God remains silent. He doesn't answer Job's questions, at least not yet.
But why does God stay silent? Doesn't he see how much Job is suffering?
That's one of the story's deepest questions. God's silence can be interpreted in different ways. Some scholars suggest it's a test of faith. Others see it as a way to teach that we don't always get immediate answers.
I see. It's like the silence is part of the lesson, but that must have been unbearable for Job.
No doubt. Job even says, "I cry out to you, O God, but you do not answer." It's a sincere cry laden with pain, but even so, he doesn't stop seeking. Now it's Zophar's turn, the third friend, to speak. And honestly, he's the harshest of them all.
Harsher? In what way?
Zophar doesn't mince words. He basically says, "You're suffering less than you deserve." In his view, Job should admit that he has sinned, ask for forgiveness, and move on. But Job won't accept this accusation. He knows he hasn't committed any sin that would justify such suffering.
Man, what kind of friend says that to someone who's already lost everything?
Exactly. But Zophar believes he's defending God's justice. He doesn't realize that by doing so, he's being insensitive to Job's pain.
So what does Job say to him?
Job responds firmly. "You speak as though you know everything about God. But what do you really know? Who can fathom the mind of the Almighty?" With this reply, Job not only defends himself, he puts his friends in their place. They don't have the answers they pretend to have. After lengthy debates, the situation seems to be at a standstill. Job grows more and more frustrated with his friends. They, for their part, keep insisting on Job's guilt.
And the saddest part is, these friends could have been a support system, right? But in the end, they only made his suffering worse.
Exactly. But the story isn't over yet. Despite all the pain, Job never abandons his search for answers. He keeps calling out to God even in the silence.
That's what impresses me most about Job. He's human. He feels pain, anger, doubt, but he never completely loses faith. That's an incredible strength.
I agree, and that's what makes his story so powerful. Job shows us that it's possible to question without losing our connection to God. He teaches us that faith and doubt can coexist.
And that friends need to be better listeners, right?
Definitely. But for now, let's leave Job to his questions. Soon enough, he'll get answers, but not in the way he expects. While the debates between Job and his friends drag on, a new voice emerges. Until now, everything seemed centered on Job, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar, but here comes a young man named Elihu.
Elihu? Who's he? I don't even remember that guy in the story.
That's right. Elihu is a character who often goes unnoticed, but he's crucial. Young and full of opinions, he patiently listened to everything up to this point, and now he feels he needs to speak.
He was just listening? Like he was there the whole time, silent, until he decided to jump into the conversation.
Exactly. In the cultural context of that time, respect for elders was very strong. So as a young man, Elihu waited his turn, hearing everyone out before giving his opinion.
Okay, but does he step in to help, or just to make things even more complicated?
It depends on how you interpret it. Some scholars see Elihu as a more balanced voice. while others think he makes the same mistakes as the other friends. When Elihu finally starts speaking, his approach is quite different. He doesn't directly accuse Job of sin, but he also doesn't absolve him. He has an interesting view of suffering.
Oh, here we go. What's his theory?
Elihu suggests that suffering isn't necessarily a punishment, but it can be a way for God to teach or correct. He says something like, God speaks to us in various ways, and suffering can be one of them.
That makes sense. I mean, sometimes pain does make us grow, right? Like, we learn something we wouldn't otherwise.
Exactly. But the issue here is that Elihu assumes Job is suffering because God wants to teach him something, and that, in a way, still places the blame on Job.
So, he's somewhere in the middle. He doesn't accuse, but he doesn't comfort either?
That's right. Elihu believes Job is wrong to question God's justice. He says, "Who are you to demand explanations from the Almighty?" To him, Job should accept the suffering and trust in God's purposes. Elihu's role is one of the most debated by scholars. Some believe he serves as a bridge between the human speeches and the divine response that's coming.
Wait, so God is still going to speak? I thought he'd stay silent until the end.
Hang on, we're not there yet. But yes, God will answer. And Elihu sets the stage for that. He changes the tone of the conversation, shifting the focus away from accusations and toward a broader perspective, God's sovereignty.
I see. So even if he doesn't solve everything, Elihu steers the debate in a new direction.
Exactly. He emphasizes that God is greater than we can understand, and that we should trust him even when we don't comprehend his reasons. And how does Job react? He listens quietly. Unlike the heated responses he gave to his other friends, he doesn't argue back against Elihu.
Why not? Does that mean he agrees with what Elihu said?
We don't know for sure. Some think Job was simply worn out from all the debate and didn't want to keep it going. Others say he recognized some truth in Elihu's words, even if he didn't fully agree.
That makes sense. After all that, sometimes silence is the best response.
True. But what's most interesting is that Job's silence also marks a transition in the narrative. It's as if he's waiting for something greater, something only God can answer. Before we move on, it's important to reflect on what this part of the story teaches us. Elihu brought up a point that still resonates today. Suffering can have purposes we don't understand.
That reminds me of something I once heard. Sometimes the questions are more important than the answers. Maybe suffering is there to make us ask questions, right?
Exactly. And Job's story shows us that these questions are valid, but it also reminds us that answers won't always come in our timing or in the way we expect.
And there's one more thing, the role of friends. They were supposed to be supportive, but they just made things worse. Elihu was the only one who brought something different, even if it wasn't perfect.
That's true. And that teaches us a lot about how to deal with other people's suffering. Sometimes just listening is enough. Other times, we need to be careful with our words so we don't add to someone's pain.
And above all, remember that we don't always know the reason for everything. Some things only God understands.
Finally, after long discussions between Job and his friends, and after Elihu's speech, God's silence is broken, and the scene is simply majestic. Job doesn't get an ordinary answer. He is confronted directly by the Almighty.
Hold on, God appears like he speaks directly to Job. How does that happen?
Exactly. God appears in the midst of a whirlwind, a colossal storm that symbolizes his majesty and power. Imagine the impact. Job, a man already devastated inside and out, now stands in the presence of the Creator himself.
Wow. So what does he say? Does he explain everything, like why Job suffered so much?
That's the intriguing part. God doesn't start by explaining anything. Instead, he asks Job a series of rhetorical questions. He asks, "Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Who determined its dimensions?"
So God doesn't respond directly. He asks questions. Why?
Good question. These questions have a clear purpose: to show Job and us the vastness of the divine creation and how impossible it is to fully comprehend God's ways. He's not humiliating Job. He's highlighting the difference between the human and the divine. God goes on describing the complexity of his creation. He speaks of the stars, the depths of the ocean, of wild animals. He mentions the behemoth and the leviathan, mythical creatures that symbolize power and mystery.
Wait, behemoth and leviathan. What are those creatures? Did they really exist, or are they symbolic?
Great question. Some scholars believe the behemoth represents a real animal, like the hippopotamus, and the leviathan perhaps a crocodile. But many interpret these creatures as symbols. They represent untamable forces of nature, showing that God even controls chaos.
Oh, I see. So God's basically saying, look, I created all of this. Do you really think you can grasp my plans?
Exactly. And it's not a cruel rebuke. It's an invitation to humility. God is showing Job that creation is so vast, so intricate, that no human being can grasp its entirety. And how does Job react to all this? He, who spent entire chapters crying out for answers, now stands before God, hearing these questions that challenge his understanding.
I imagine he must have been speechless.
Exactly. Job says, "I am unworthy. How can I reply to you? I put my hand over my mouth." He recognizes that, in the face of divine greatness, his questions are limited.
That's so profound. He doesn't abandon the questions because they're bad, but because he realizes he can't understand everything. It's a lesson in humility, right?
Yes, and it's one of the central messages of the story. Job realizes his perspective is limited, and while that doesn't lessen his pain, it helps him see his place in the universe. After this transformative encounter, God does something unexpected. He turns to Job's friends, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar, and severely rebukes them. God says they spoke wrongly about him, unlike Job.
Wait a second. God defends Job, even after all his complaints and questioning.
Exactly. Because unlike the friends, Job was honest in his search for God. He did question, yes, but he never abandoned his faith. He sought to understand, while the friends tried to impose simplistic answers.
That's really powerful. It's like God is saying, I prefer honesty over ready-made answers.
Perfect. And God tells Job's friends to offer sacrifices and asks Job to pray for them. It's an act of reconciliation.
And after that, what happens to Job?
God restores everything Job lost and doubles it. He receives new children, even greater wealth, and a long and fulfilling life. But most importantly, Job emerges from this experience with a more mature faith and a deeper understanding of God. Job's story ends on a note of reconciliation and hope, but it leaves many questions open, especially about human suffering.
Yeah, because in the end, God never really explained why he allowed Job to suffer, did he?
That's true, and that's one of the beautiful things about this story. It doesn't give easy answers. Instead, it invites us to reflect on our relationship with God, our faith, and our own humanity.
It also reminds us that we won't always understand everything, but that doesn't mean God isn't in control.
Exactly. Job's story challenges us to trust even when everything seems senseless, and it teaches us that even in suffering, there's room to question, to seek, and to grow.
It's a story that transcends time. Even today, it helps us deal with our own challenges and doubts.
No doubt about it. And that's why Job's story remains so relevant. It's not just about a righteous man who suffered. It's about all of us, our questions, our pain, and our search for something greater. With Job's restoration, the story reaches its emotional climax. Job now has more possessions, more children, and a long life. But how do you think he felt after all this?
I wonder that too. Like, did he really find peace? Because even getting everything back, the scars from what he lost must have remained.
No doubt. Job was human just like us. He loved his first family, felt physical and emotional pain, and went through moments of despair. Restoration doesn't erase suffering, but faith and experience transformed him profoundly.
Maybe that's the big lesson, right? That pain leaves marks, but it also changes us, sometimes for the better, if we have the strength to learn from it.
Exactly. And that's what makes Job so fascinating. He's a figure of faith, but also deeply human. He didn't just survive suffering, he used it to grow spiritually. Job's faith is one of the main messages of the story, but it's not a blind faith, as many think. Job questioned, argued, and poured out his heart to God, and still his faith remained.
That's true, and it's so different from what we imagine when we think of perfect faith. He had doubts, felt abandoned, but never gave up on God.
Yes. And it's interesting how this story contradicts the idea that faith means never doubting. Job teaches us that it's possible to have faith even when everything seems lost.
That makes sense. Faith isn't about having all the answers, but about continuing the search, even in the dark.
Exactly. And God recognizes this in Job. He doesn't rebuke Job's questions or his complaints. On the contrary, he exalts him for being honest. Another powerful aspect of Job's story is its approach to suffering. It forces us to confront a tough question: why do good people suffer?
And the answer isn't that simple, right? Because in the end, Job never discovers the exact reason for his suffering.
Exactly. And maybe that's the main point. Job's story shows us that we won't always understand the reasons why, but that doesn't mean suffering lacks purpose.
I also find it interesting how God's silence at the beginning of the story reflects what many people feel. When we're in the thick of pain, it seems like God isn't listening.
Yes, and that's why the story is so real. Job teaches us that it's normal to feel that way, but also challenges us to keep trusting, even when everything seems silent. Speaking of suffering, another important aspect of the story is Job's friends. They started off well with silence and just being there, but they made everything worse.
Yeah, they really messed up. Instead of supporting Job, they started accusing him. How could anyone do that to a friend who's already devastated?
Unfortunately, it's more common than we think. Sometimes in trying to explain suffering, we end up judging or minimizing other people's pain.
That's true. And I think Job's story teaches us how not to be a friend, right? Sometimes just being there is enough.
Absolutely. Job didn't need answers, he needed support. And that's something we can all learn: the power of silence, listening, and empathy. Finally, God's response is one of the most profound moments of the story. He doesn't explain the reason for Job's suffering, but he reveals his sovereignty.
Is that enough? I mean, Job suffered so much. Shouldn't God, give a more direct explanation?
It's a valid question. But the point of the divine response isn't to solve the mystery of suffering. It's to remind us of something greater, that God is in control, even when we don't understand.
I see. It's like God is saying, trust me, even when it doesn't make sense.
Exactly. Job's story challenges us to trust divine wisdom, even in the most difficult circumstances.
And that's really powerful, because deep down, that's what faith is, right? Trusting without needing all the answers.
Job's story isn't just an ancient account. It's had a profound impact on theology, philosophy, and even popular culture.
How so? Are you saying it influenced more than just religion?
Definitely. In theology, Job is a central reference for discussing the problem of evil and suffering. In philosophy, thinkers like Kierkegaard and Camus explored Job's lessons in their reflections on human existence.
Wow! So Job's story is like a landmark in the discussion of why we suffer.
Exactly. And even in popular culture, Job appears as a symbol of patience, resilience, and faith. Job's journey is one of the most powerful stories ever told. It not only moves us, but teaches us about the complexity of life, faith, and suffering.
And it remains relevant because these questions never stop being important. Who hasn't wondered why bad things happen to good people?
Exactly. And Job's answer isn't simple, but it's deeply human. It challenges us to trust, to seek, and to find meaning even in pain.
And above all, to never give up, even when everything seems lost.
Exactly. Because in the end, Job's story isn't just about suffering, it's about redemption, faith, and hope. We've reached the end of Job's journey. After enduring so much suffering, he is restored by God. But was this restoration merely material, or was there something deeper going on?
Good question. Because even though all his possessions were returned and he had a new family, the losses Job suffered can't just be erased, right?
Exactly. Job's restoration goes beyond wealth and children. It symbolizes the redemption of the soul. Job not only gets back what he lost, but he also gains a deeper understanding of God and of himself.
I see. So what really changes in Job isn't just what he has, but who he becomes.
That's right. He becomes someone who has seen the worst in life, yet found hope in the midst of pain. And that transformation might be the greatest blessing of all. Job's story isn't just about him, it's about all of us. It reflects our own struggle with suffering, faith, and purpose.
That's true, Because even if we don't go through something as extreme as Job did, everyone has had moments of pain and doubt.
Exactly. Job is a mirror for our toughest questions. Why do bad things happen? Is God listening? And in the end, is there a purpose to it all?
And the most interesting part is that Job's story doesn't give us all the answers. It leaves room for us to reflect, to find our own meaning.
That's right. Job teaches us that faith isn't the absence of doubt, but the choice to trust even when we don't understand everything. Theologically, Job's story is a milestone. It challenges the traditional idea that suffering is always a divine punishment.
And that was a very strong idea at the time, right? Like, if you're suffering, it must be because you did something wrong.
Exactly. But Job shows that suffering can have other purposes. It can test us, teach us, or even be a mystery beyond our comprehension.
And what does that say about God? Because in the end, he allowed Job to go through all that suffering.
That's one of the central questions of the story. God permitted the suffering, but he never abandoned Job. And in the end, he revealed his sovereignty, showing that his ways are greater than we can understand.
I see. So the point isn't to know why we suffer, but to trust that God is in control, even when we don't see the full picture.
Job's story has transcended its time and place. It has influenced generations, cultures, and even other religions. But why does it remain so powerful today?
I think it's because everyone can relate to it in some way. Who hasn't felt like Job at some point, wondering why bad things happen?
Absolutely. And Job is unique because he's not perfect. He's honest, vulnerable, human. He questions, but he doesn't abandon his faith. That makes him a realistic role model, someone we can connect with.
And I think the fact that he's heard by God is very significant. It shows that our questions and doubts don't push God away. In fact, he answers.
Exactly. God's response to Job is a reminder that he cares even when we don't understand his ways. So what can we learn from Job? His story is full of practical and spiritual lessons that are still relevant today.
For example,
first, Job teaches us about the importance of being honest with God. He didn't hide his feelings. He vented, questioned, and asked for answers.
That's very freeing, because sometimes we think we can't question, that God only accepts perfect faith.
Exactly. But Job shows that God values our sincerity. He wants an authentic relationship, not a superficial faith.
What else?
Another lesson is about the importance of trusting even in silence. Job didn't get immediate answers, but he kept seeking, and in the end, he found something far greater than he had imagined.
That's hard, but also really inspiring, because trusting in the silence requires a lot of courage.
No doubt. And finally, Job teaches us to look beyond our immediate circumstances. His suffering seemed pointless, but in the end, he found a greater purpose. Job's story isn't just a theological lesson, it's an invitation to reflect on how we deal with our own pain and questions.
And also on how we deal with the pain of others. Because after seeing Job's friends, it's clear we need to learn how to be more empathetic.
Absolutely. Job's story challenges us to be better friends, better listeners, and better companions on the journey.
And it also reminds us that suffering isn't the end. Even in the darkest moments, there's always room for hope.
Exactly. Job shows us that even in the midst of pain, we can find meaning, redemption, and above all, a deeper relationship with God. And so we conclude Job's story, not as a narrative that solves all mysteries, but as an invitation to reflect, grow, and trust.
And above all, as a reminder that even in the greatest hardships, God is present.
Exactly. May Job's story inspire us to seek God, not for easy answers, but for a deep and genuine relationship.
And may it teach us to face our pain with faith, courage, and hope.
Because in the end, like Job, we can find redemption even in the midst of suffering. And so the story of Job comes to an end, a profound account of suffering, faith, and redemption. More than ready-made answers, Job teaches us to value our questions, to persist in the search for meaning, and to trust, even in the face of life's mysteries.
That's right. The story of Job isn't just about one man who suffered. It's about all of us. The courage to keep going, even when we don't understand why things happen.
And if you enjoyed this video, be sure to check out our other content on the channel. We've got videos on inspiring Bible stories, theological reflections, and historical curiosities that will deepen your knowledge even further.
That's it. Don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the notification bell so you won't miss any new videos. Share this with friends and family to spread these heart-touching messages.
We'll see you in the next video. Until then, keep reflecting, keep growing, and keep seeking the best that God has for your life.
And remember, the greatest lessons come during the most challenging times. See you soon.
See you in the next video.